Golden Audiobooks presents. Narrated by Andrew Hint. Cloud, the Smiter, by Arthur Gask. Chapter 14. Andrew the GARROTTER. Exactly at 2 o'clock that afternoon, the inspector and LaRose met on the path just in front of the White House. The detective was dressed now in ordinary clothes, but he had deemed it best they should each come to the rendezvous by a different way. "Nice quiet little place this, ROMILLY," he remarked interestedly. "Quite the ideal spot for the headquarters of the Smiter and his gang. Good thing you managed to break them up when you did." He walked up to the garden gate. "Now you tell me the place has been quite unoccupied since the departure of J.A. Cloud?" "Quite," replied the inspector, "and no one has been in it except ourselves, myself and the criminal investigation lot, I mean. Yeah, locks on both doors. Miss McIver passed over the keys to me after the arrest, and they have never been out of my custody since. The place is just as it was when Cloud was living here." LaRose thoughtfully took in the outside of the house. He muttered. "One story, with I suppose the usual 4 rooms. Pretty but quite ordinary, and no one would ever dream the dreadful history that it holds." He smiled grimly at the inspector. "They ought to let in a tablet in the wall there, Mark. Here for 1 year lived an enemy of the human race." "Very appropriate, I am sure," said the inspector drily, "and it would add greatly to the selling value of the house. I'll mention it to Miss McIver next time when I see her." "So this is where the woman saw Andrew," went on LaRose. "Just where I am standing now." The inspector nodded. "She said he was just inside the gate." LaRose looked up and down the road, and then he shook his head. "No, he would have turned off at once round the sandhill somewhere," he remarked very quietly, as if he were speaking to himself. "It would be harder going than the road, of course, but he would be the sooner out of sight, and he didn't know at all how much start he was going to get. I don't suppose he went very far, though, and as it was bright moonlight, he would probably hide somewhere and watch the house." The detective turned round sharply. "Well, come on, ROMILLY, let's go inside." In a few moments they had unlocked the front door and were standing in the hall. The blinds were all drawn, and the place was in semi-darkness. The inspector closed the door behind them. "Pshaw, what a smell of oranges," said LaRose suddenly. "Didn't you take away all the food?" "Yes," replied the inspector, frowning. "The men were supposed to have cleared it all out the next day." They went into the front room, and the inspector pulled up a chair and sat down at the table. "This is where the wretch sat and watched the garage, Gilbert," he said with a sort of shudder. "He'd sit here for hours at a time with his binoculars, and in the end it began to get on our nerves. We thought any moment he might try a feeler on us with his automatic." But the detective made no comment. He was intently taking in all the surroundings of the room and was picturing, in his mind, something of the mode of life that the former tenant must have lived. And here, no doubt, all his plans were made. He said meditatively, after a long silence, "Here he sat like some venomous spider weaving his web, for instance, for that poor old man opposite." The detective slowly shook his head. "Oh, if only these walls could speak, Mark, and echo back his thoughts. How we should shudder at the cruelty of the man. His was a dreadful mind, and he was crime incarnate in a way." They went over the house together, and an odd silence came upon them both. With all his sang-froid, the inspector wished himself out in the road again. They came finally to the kitchen, and LaRose settled himself then into a well-padded and comfortable armchair. He smiled a grim smile. "And here Martin no doubt often sat, too," he said softly, thinking perhaps of his own death as likely least of all. And yet, the detective took out his watch. "He's been dead now exactly 6 hours." The inspector frowned. He was not pleased at the reminder. Hangings with him were by no means the ordinary affairs of life, and the ceremony that morning at the stockade, in the early light of the dawn, had left an uncomfortable impression upon his mind. The eyes of the detective roamed intently round the room. "Hello," he exclaimed suddenly. "Who's been swatting flies?" He got up at once and walked over to the window. He prodded with his finger at some dead flies that lay on the windowsill, and then, after quite a long while, it seemed, he returned thoughtfully to his armchair and again renewed his scrutiny of of the room. The inspector leant against the dresser and yawned. He was bored and he wanted to go. Suddenly, there was the sound of rustling by the fireplace, and a mouse came down the chimney. It ran out into the room, but catching sight of the two men, instantly wheeled round and ran back up the chimney the way it came. It was down again, however, in another second, and this time, braving the inspector's feet, it took refuge behind some cans in a corner of the kitchen. At the same moment, a tiny fleck of plaster dropped from the ceiling onto the floor. A startled expression came instantly into LaRose's face, one almost of incredulous surprise. He dropped his eyes upon the ground for quite a minute, then he remained motionless, and then suddenly he looked up at the inspector and began to talk very quickly. "You know, the Smiter was a most unusual man, Mark," he said, speaking loudly, "and in any profession would have made a name for himself if he had gone straight. His intuition was really wonderful, and he was one of the finest judges of character I have ever known. For instance, he went into a bank one day to cash a check. He had never been near the bank before. There was a whole row of clerks behind the counter at their desks, and he just cast his eye down them as they worked. It came out afterwards that he was looking for a likely confederate inside the bank, and unerringly, in that one moment, he picked upon the one man who was most likely to serve his ends. With no more ado, he made overtures to him within 24 hours, as if he were quite sure his advances would be accepted." The detective sighed. Yes, he recognized offhand all the possibilities of a promising criminal in that young fellow, and yet for 10 years the man had been a most trusted servant at the bank. "I'll tell you another anecdote about Old Cloud too, an amusing one this time." LaRose went on to recite another episode in the Smiter's career, and then in the middle of it, but without interrupting his speech, he stealthily took a pencil and a piece of paper out of his pocket and quickly scribbled a few words. Very quietly, he pushed the paper across the table, and the amazed inspector read, "This house is inhabited. There's someone above US in the rafters under the roof." LaRose went on talking, and then he motioned for the inspector to push the paper back. "Where's the trapdoor leading to the roof?" he wrote next, and he passed over the pencil as well this time. "At the end of the hall," wrote the inspector, and the correspondence closed when LaRose added underneath, "Now you talk. I want to think." It was a queer comedy then that was enacted in the little kitchen of the White House. Inspector ROMILLY, leaning carelessly against the dresser, related laboriously all the happenings that led up to the Smiter's arrest. He took plenty of time in the narration, too, and it could hardly have been said that he omitted anything at all relevant to the affair. But for the greater part of the recital, he had no audience, or no audience that was visible, at any rate, for LaRose had taken off his boots and, treading with the wariness of a cat, had disappeared from the room. For 3, 5, 10 minutes he was away, and then just when the inspector was wondering how on earth the story could be dragged out any longer, he tiptoed back and very quietly resumed his footgear. "Thank you, ROMILLY," he said with a tired drawl. "You are an admirable raconteur, I am sure, and I could listen to it over and over again, but I think we ought to be going now. There's a lot to do when we get back. I've seen all I want to hear." He winked his eye and held out another slip of paper. "Leave me behind," the inspector read. "I'm sure I'll get him. I believe it's Andrew. Don't worry, but it may be a long wait, perhaps until tomorrow before he comes down." Then the detective spoke quite loudly and very impressively. "But look here, ROMILLY, we must not be seen together, you and I, and don't tell the chief even that I am in the city. We'll each go back by the same way we came, and I'll meet you at headquarters exactly 2 hours from now." They walked noisily towards the hall door, and then LaRose plucked suddenly at the inspector's arm. "Handcuffs," his lips framed rather than his voice whispered. There was a moment's hesitation, and then the inspector, with a skeptical smile, abstracted a pair from his back pocket and handed them over. "Too impossible to be true," he whispered softly. He shrugged his shoulders. "But then, you are Gilbert LaRose." The front door was pulled open. There was some shuffling of feet, and the inspector, talking loudly to himself, went down the garden path alone. A silence then fell over the White House, and the flies descended from the ceiling, and the mouse came out from behind the cans. But it was not the silence of peace and rest. It was not the silence of soft, gentle sleep. It was the silence of men waiting, with eternity behind the pressing of a trigger. Up above Above the rooms of the house, and upon a rough bed of sacks just under the roof, was stretched a man. From head to foot he was drenched in perspiration, and the expression on his face was one of mingled fury and dismay. His eyes were wide and staring, and with his head low down against the laths, his ears were strained to catch the slightest sound. With one hand he clutched tightly to an automatic pistol, and the fingers of the other were closed round a small tin box that he was carrying in his jacket pocket. He was so still that it seemed he hardly breathed. He was waiting, but for what he was exactly waiting, even he himself, with all his intensity of pose, could not have told. And in the hall below, another man was waiting, but he was waiting confidently and with due regard to his convenience and comfort. He had made himself a bed with some cushions in an alcove just behind the front door, and he was stretched out so that his head just protruded sufficiently round the corner of the alcove to allow of his eyes having full view of the trapdoor in the ceiling above. This man had an eager and expectant look upon his face, but with all his eagerness, he was yet still serene and calm. Like the other watcher, he grasped an automatic pistol with his right hand, but unlike him, from the expression of his face at all events, he seemed to know exactly what he was waiting for. Half an hour passed, and there was no appreciable change in the positions of either of these two men. One continued to lie with his ears strained, and the other continued to stare with a gaze that never faltered upon the trapdoor. Slowly the afternoon passed, and the dusk of evening fell, but still one listened and the other watched. It was a duel of two minds. Andrew, known as the Garrotter, was very much of the type of man as described to the inspector by Gilbert LaRose. A criminal to the very tips of his fingers, he was a man, as has been said, of great daring, and in times of danger, of great resource. He was also a man of some imagination, and delighted to pit himself against the stereotyped procedure of the authorities with whom he was always at war. Upon the night when Burke and Masterton were surprised at the White House, he was just about to walk up the garden path when the cries of the former arrested him. He sensed instantly then what had happened, but without losing his head, he turned at once and walked calmly back onto the road. There, without hurrying, he passed the woman and the two little boys. He saw they had been attracted by the shouting and had stopped to see what it was. He walked quite calmly by them, and then, confident that they were giving no attention to him, he broke into a quick run. But as LaRose had afterwards surmised, he did not run very far. All places in the vicinity he knew were equally as dangerous to him and equally as safe. So in little more even than 100 yards, he turned off from the road onto the sand. He found a patch of high grass nearby, and throwing himself down, he proceeded coolly to watch the house. In a few seconds, he saw the detectives rush down the garden path, and he heard them interrogate the woman as to which way he had gone. But it was plain from her attitude that the woman could tell them nothing. She looked round everywhere, and then he saw her shake her head. He watched the detectives return reluctantly to the house, and then, imbued with a sudden idea, he forsook his hiding place, and making a wide detour, boldly approached the White House from the back. He crept over the fence into the yard, and standing on the windowsill was able to see over the blind into the very room where the prisoners had been brought. He got a close view of Inspector ROMILLY and the detectives, and as a matter of pure routine, took careful stock of their appearances for future guidance. He considered the number of them and lovingly fingered the little automatic that he was carrying in his pocket. He had half a mind to empty his pistol among them and then chance it and run. Presently, he saw the prisoners taken away, and then the departure of the detectives from the house. He waited until they had all been gone about a quarter of an hour, and then leisurely forced one of the windows at the back and let himself into the kitchen. Believing himself at any rate then safe for the night, he lay down upon one of the beds and in a few minutes was fast asleep. He was up, however, again in the early moments of the dawn, and his first proceeding was to thoroughly explore the house. It was in his mind that he might hide in it somewhere until the hue and cry for him had at any rate partially died down. He judged that of all places in South Australia, the White House itself would be the very last one that the police would search for him. He climbed up through the trapdoor into the roof, and making himself a bed between the rafters with some old sacks, for 36 hours he alternately dozed and brooded away the time. No one came near the house, and no sign came to him from the outside world. The second evening at dusk, he boldly left the house and went into Glenelg to buy some food. Then, having thought out his plans, about midnight he broke into a suburban railway station and stole, amongst other things, some porter's clothes, returning again across country to the White House during the night. After that, everything was easy for him, and clothed as a porter in the regulation South Australian Railway uniform. From henceforward, he moved about everywhere exactly as he pleased. Nobody questioned him, and nobody gave him a second look. He went about the city free as air, had his meals regularly at different eating houses, and returned home every evening to the White House to sleep. He never had a moment of anxiety or misgiving. He took care, however, to keep as far away as possible from any railway officials whom he saw. Later, he made no attempt to get out of the city or the state. Indeed, he was now staying on for a definite purpose. With the vanity always associated with his type of criminals, he had determined to show his contempt for the authorities generally by revenging himself upon the 4 police officers who had been primarily responsible for the arrest of his companions. He had interestedly perused the daily newspapers, and the threats of Burke during the extradition proceedings had appealed strongly to his imagination. He brooded over the matter, and in a few days the assassination of Inspector ROMILLY and the detectives became quite an obsession. He learned all their names from the proceedings at the police court, and he easily got hold of their home addresses from a perusal of the voting lists in the public library. He killed the 3 detectives in the way already described, but to get Inspector ROMILLY, he found a much more difficult matter. Although, to all appearances, quite contemptuous of any danger he might be in, the inspector was nevertheless, however, leaving nothing to chance, and 3 times, almost in as many days, he changed his sleeping quarters. Also, when he had to proceed out on business from the police headquarters in Victoria Square, never by any chance, so Andrew found, did he return by the same way. He always reappeared from an entirely different direction. Still, Andrew had made up his mind to get him, and he was quite confident it was only a matter of time. And this, then, was the position up to that afternoon when Andrew, awaking from an afternoon slumber among the rafters of the White House, heard to his annoyance the voices of Inspector ROMILLY and LaRose down in the hall below him. For the moment he was only annoyed, as he had no idea who either of them were, and he supposed without much interest that they were just house agents, or some people who had come from the proprietor to look over the property. But, mixed up with unlawful proceedings as he had been all his adult life, he was by habit alert always to the possible proximity of any of his natural enemies, the police, and he very quickly took on a graver view of the situation. Before even the interrupters had walked the whole length of the hall, for one of them, it struck him, had the unmistakable tread of a policeman. Immediately, then he crawled over the rafters and put his ear down to the crevice of the trap door that led up through the ceiling. Almost at once, he found his suspicions were justified. He heard one of the men below talking about the Smiter, and then the other addressed the first speaker as Mark. The inspector, he ejaculated to himself. His jaw dropped a little. And who's the other one now? He had not long to wait. Gilbert, my boy, he heard the inspector say. Gilbert, hissed Andrew to himself. Gilbert. His jaw dropped quite a lot this time. Not Gilbert LaRose. An icy feeling ran down the garrotter's spine, and his automatic was out of his pocket in a flash. Sweat stood out on his forehead in big beads, and his heart pumped like an engine at full speed. Gilbert LaRose, he breathed hoarsely. And he's come here. Then some sort of reaction set in, and he wiped the sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. He smiled a sneering smile and slipped the automatic back into his pocket. Plenty of time, he muttered thickly. Plenty of time, and I'll get both of them before they get me. He heard them go into the kitchen, and he prepared to shift his position towards the chimney, where there was, he knew, a loose brick that he could pull out. He must hear every word they said now. Who's been swatting flies? Presently he heard LaRose say, and the sweat again came to his forehead. Yes, damn him, he swore savagely. It's LaRose. He's looking about. Yes, it's Gilbert LaRose. The ensuing half hour then was a terrible one for the listener under the roof. Terrible because of the suspense and perplexity he was in. Rack his brains as he might, he could determine in no way whether it was by chance or design that LaRose was so near him now. From his former years in New South Wales, he had a lively knowledge of LaRose, and of all the detectives in the Commonwealth, he had fear only for him. Callous and hardened as he was to all the risks of criminal life, the proximity of the Sydney detective now brought a cold shudder into his heart. LaRose had nearly caught him so many times. LaRose knew so much about him and his associates, and LaRose had so often fathomed the workings of their minds. And now this man was close upon his tracks, and within a few feet actually of where he lay. He was certain too that LaRose was devising something, for why was he so silent in the room below, and why was the coarser-fibered inspector being left to do all the talking? LaRose was quick and alert, he knew, and it was not like him to listen uninterruptingly to a long story. He should be breaking in continually. He should be asking questions. He should be cutting the narrative short. Yes, certainly, LaRose was plotting something, he was sure. Then he heard LaRose suddenly re-enter the conversation, but his suspicions were in no way allayed. Andrew could be analytical as LaRose himself when he was in danger, and it came to him instinctively that what the detective was now saying did not ring quite true. There was too much in his tones of the man who had just come to some conclusion and who was masking his intentions in some way. In a few moments he heard them both apparently leave the house, and then, continuing to attempt to analyze the position, his fears and perplexities increased fourfold. What was going to happen now? He asked himself in a muck sweat. Was he trapped? Had LaRose any suspicion that anyone was hiding in the house? Had he seen any trace of anything in the room below? Andrew swore viciously under his breath, cursed this shaking of his hands and the dry feeling that had come into his throat. But how? After all, he suddenly asked himself, did he know that it was LaRose who had been there? Oh, but it was LaRose right enough. He could be sure of that. No one but LaRose could have spoken of the Smiter as that man had done, and the fact alone that the inspector had called him Gilbert clinched the matter there. Well, if it were LaRose, that did not mean necessarily that he was aware someone was above him under the roof. What could there be now to have made him suspicious? But he had asked, who's been swatting flies? That meant something, of course. To his cost, he knew something of LaRose's mind. LaRose never asked idle questions, and there was purpose, deadly purpose, always in his mind. Well, if the dead flies had made him curious, what had happened after? Had anything happened at all? What had LaRose done next? At any rate, he had gone away. But had he gone away? There had been a lot of shuffling of feet by the front door, too much shuffling. Now he came to think of it, and the inspector's voice, he remembered now, was the only one that he had heard as they both were supposed to be walking down the garden path. Well, if LaRose had not gone off with the inspector, he must be waiting somewhere down below in the house. And what would he be waiting for then? Waiting for him to come down, of course, so that he could plug him and then deliver him over to the police. The police. Perhaps the inspector had already gone off for help, and in a few minutes the house would be surrounded and they would try to storm the place. Well, they would never take him alive, anyhow, and he would not be by any means the first to meet with death. His thoughts ran on, and his eyes blinked and blinked in the perplexity that he was in. But always his ears were straining towards the room below, and always his hand was ready to the automatic in his pocket. Slowly the hours of the afternoon passed, and then softly dusk fell. Soon it grew quite dark under the roof. In the blackness and the silence there were those of the tomb. Hour succeeded hour, and still there was no movement anywhere in the house. Towards midnight, however, Andrew changed on to his other side, and the faintest sound of his movement reached to the ears of the watcher in the hall below. A smile then crossed over the latter's face, and with infinite care, he lifted the safety catch of the automatic that he was holding in his hand. Undoubtedly, he was expecting something to happen, for when about a quarter of an hour had passed, and everything had settled into stillness again, he sighed disappointedly and returned the catch of his pistol to the safety position. The night crept on, and the limbs of the detective became stiff and cramped with cold. He had to chafe them continually to keep some feeling in them, and it worried him a lot that it was only with the greatest effort that he could continue to stare in the direction where he knew the trapdoor in the ceiling was. He was expecting now to see a speck of light there soon, the flash of an electric torch. In the meanwhile, Andrew had become gradually affected by the pangs of thirst. He had drunk drunk nothing since the previous morning, and the sweats that had bathed him had dried him up like a sponge. He was not cold like LaRose, for a sort of fever had seized him. The worries of his mind, too, were goading on his body to uneasiness, and he wanted to twist and turn with every moment as he lay. But he dared not move ever so little, for if the detective were below, he knew from the thin layer of plaster between them how easily every sound would reach him. So he kept himself immovable, and in time the very stillness began to torment almost as much as the thirst. He cursed LaRose deeply. Then, towards morning, it began to come insistently to him that he was a fool, that his fears were all imaginary, and that in the hall below there was no one there. He put the idea away contemptuously at first, but it grew upon him, and, encouraged by his thirst and his bodily discomfort, soon almost it had mastered his mind. Yes, he was a fool, he swore. He had worked himself up into a fever, and he had no cause to fear. Just because he had killed a few flies in the kitchen the previous morning, how could anyone, even LaRose, guess from that it was he, Andrew, and that he was then hiding under the roof? Yes, the whole idea was preposterous, and he had worried himself for nothing. He would go down, he would get a drink of water, he would, but still he would give no chances of being taken alive. A minute later, and in the gathering light of dawn, he was hitching a length of rope on to a short rail in the rafters, preparatory to taking off the cover of the trapdoor. He was still, however, holding a pistol in his right hand. The detective felt sodden for want of sleep. For 2 nights upon his journey from Sydney, he had been traveling in the train, and now this third night he had never been able to so much as close an eye. Bodily, he was exhausted to the last degree, and yet as a contrast, mentally, he was bright, confident, and extremely on the alert. It was the certainty that he was right that was buoying him up. Many times during that night he had figured it all up, and there was no doubt whatever in his mind that someone, and it must be Andrew, was hiding above him in the roof. To begin with, he told himself he had sensed the smell of oranges directly he had come into the hall, and then afterwards he had found no oranges or orange peel at all in the house. Now the smell of an orange, he was quite aware, was only a matter of at most a few hours. It was broadcast only whilst the orange was being eaten, and very quickly disappeared afterwards. So it had come to him very early that someone had been visiting the house, and yet the inspector had told him positively that he alone had had the key. Then he had noticed dead flies upon the window sill in the kitchen, and fresh fly blood stains upon the window itself. Also, when he had touched the dead flies, he had found their bodies were quite soft and not dried up as they would have been if they were even days old. It was then he had begun to be really interested, for there should have been no flies, he knew, in a house that had been foodless and shut up for more than 6 weeks. Next, when they had been talking, the mouse had suddenly run down the chimney, to be followed immediately by the falling of a small fleck of plaster from the ceiling. The behavior of the mouse itself had been most significant. Something had frightened it down from the chimney, and when it had made to run back, the same something had frightened it down again. That, coupled with the falling fleck of plaster, had instantly suggested that someone was moving across the beams above the ceiling with the object probably of getting nearer to the chimney in order to catch more plainly what was being said. Everyone was aware how well the chimneys carried sound. Then he had taken off his boots, and, leaving the inspector talking, had gone out from the kitchen for an investigation on his own. He had soon found things that strengthened his suspicions and made him sure that someone was making use of the house. The pantry window had had the catch forced, and there was distinct evidence that the fly-proof screen outside had recently been many times taken in and out, for the edges were all rounded and polished, and there was no dust anywhere against the sides. Then he had noticed that the bath was not dry. There was water about it that would never have been there after 6 weeks. Indeed, it looked as if it had been made use of that very day, and he was almost certain, too, that he could smell soap, although there was none to be seen anywhere about the place. Then he had crept into the hall and stealthily inspected the trapdoor that led up into the roof. There was nothing unusual about the trapdoor itself, but there were distinct markings upon the linoleum just underneath. A pair of steps. He had instantly ejaculated to himself, and he was of opinion from the impressions on the floor that it had been used many times recently. In the scullery, he had found the steps, and approaching them him for a close scrutiny. His nostrils had again been instantly assailed by the smell of oranges. There was no doubt about it. He had been certain someone had eaten oranges within the last few hours. Then he had gone outside around the house, and at the back, about 100 yards away over the sand, he had seen a number of seagulls busy by a small gully. Walking quickly up, he had found they were raking over debris of food that had been buried just underneath. Some pieces of bread, the remnant of a stale cake, and orange peel galore. Some of the orange peel was quite fresh, and with a beating of his heart, he saw that it had been conveyed there in a portion of a newspaper that was only 3 days old. Lastly, he had unearthed a whole host of recently opened almond shells. Andrew, he had gasped, for Andrew he knew was a vegetarian, and it had been knocking subconsciously in his mind all along. Ever indeed since his first suspicions had been aroused, that of all people it would best fit in with the cynical character of the garrotter to make use of the house. It would be just like Andrew, he had told himself, just like the man's daring and resource, and besides, was not this the very place near where the man had been last seen? He knew so well the type of criminals which both the Smiter and Andrew had always represented. They had never been weak, frightened individuals to be stampeded into aimless directions like bolting rabbits. They had shown themselves continually as men of strong and purposeful character, and it would delight Andrew, he knew, to be doing the very thing the authorities would least of all expect. He had returned stealthily to the house, and then in a few minutes, with the departure of the inspector, his long vigil had commenced. He had certainly expected things to move more quickly than they had done, but when the night had finally settled down without anything happening, he had comforted himself with the reminder that the real psychological moment in one's thoughts was always at the dawn. It was when day was breaking that the reaction in the mind set in. In darkness, one could hold the easier to a fixed idea, but with the coming of the shadows, there was the tendency always for everything to change, and willingly or unwillingly, one had to survey an outlook entirely different from that of the night. So LaRose was not in the least degree surprised when, just as the lights were creeping gray and ghostly into the hall, he heard faint sounds of movement above the trapdoor in the roof. On the instant, he had risen to his feet and was crouching by the wall. His stiffness disappeared as if by magic. His sense of coldness had all gone, and if his face was damp and pale as death, his eyes were, nevertheless, twinkling happily, and his lips were wreathed into a confident, bright smile. Things moved very quickly. Top of the trapdoor was jerked off abruptly, and a white face was pushed down and turned sharply in every direction round the hall. Then an electric torch was flashed, and in a lightning movement LaRose was back in the alcove, with his ears, rather than his eyes, now telling him what was happening in the hall. In about half a minute, however, the torch went out, and LaRose, looking up again at the ceiling, saw suddenly a length of rope drop down from the opening of the trapdoor and hang dangling into the hall. The rope reached nearly to the floor and was knotted at short intervals. For a moment nothing happened, and then a pair of legs were thrust through the hole, and a man began to lower himself quickly down. With a thrill, LaRose saw that the man was wearing trousers with a red braid down the sides, the uniform of the South Australian Railway. The detective deliberately raised his automatic for, intending to take no risks, he was about to render Andrew helpless by shooting him in the shoulder. Suddenly, however, there was a rattle on the floor followed by a deep curse. Andrew had dropped the pistol he was carrying as he was coming down. A second later, however, and the malediction was merged into a cry of terror. For the very instant he had reached the floor, his legs had been knocked under him, and with a fierce blow he had been stretched upon his back. Before he could recover or indeed in any way take in what was happening to him, his wrists were next jerked together. There was a sharp metallic click, and he was lying handcuffed and helpless at LaRose's feet. The detective was breathing hard with his exertions, but there was no particular expression of triumph upon his face as he looked down at the prostrate man. "I'm LaRose," he said quietly, "and I've come all the way over from Sydney to get you." The prisoner, however, made no reply. He regarded him at first with a dull stare, and then, as his senses gradually came back, with a look of hatred that was beast-like in its intensity. curiosity. "It's lucky for you," went on the detective pleasantly, "that you did drop your pistol, for I should have shot you myself before you reached the ground. I was taking no chances, and I know you, Andrew, my boy." Andrew glared at him, and then his face broke into a cunning smile. "No, you don't," he said sneeringly. "You're a fool." LaRose shrugged his shoulders as if he knew he had the best of the argument, and then he smiled in his turn, but the nature of his smile was different. Suddenly, however, the expression on his face altered, for a strange feeling of uneasiness had come into his mind. Andrew was seemingly amused at something, and there was a grin almost of triumph now upon his face. "What's he up to?" LaRose asked himself. "Goodness knows he's not got much to laugh at any rate." The garrotter had half closed his eyes. He looked contemptuously at his captor, and then suddenly he began to fiercely clamp his jaws. "I told you, you were a fool," he said hoarsely. "You've not got me after all," and he spat out a piece of broken glass. The detective bent down in consternation, for the man's lips, he saw, had suddenly become flecked with blood. "Capsule, cyanide," grinned Andrew. "Never be taken alive." And on the instant his face became convulsed with pain. He grew ghastly white. His eyes started from his head, and his hands clawed in agony upon the floor. His body writhed as if he were in torture, and his chest heaved frantically for breath. A moan, a long deep moan, a moment's pause, a sigh, and then with a shuddering jerk the head fell sideways, and the man was dead. "But I couldn't help it, Mark," said the detective later. "I had no chance." Andrew suspected all along that someone was waiting for him there, and he came down from the roof with the capsule of cyanide ready in his mouth, in case he should find himself in difficulties and unable to pull the trigger first. LaRose sighed deeply. Yes, he was always a far-seeing man, was Andrew, but he wasn't a sport. He played with loaded dice. Chapter 15. The Passion Years. One morning about a month later, at breakfast time at Clyde House, Mr. Thomas McIver was feeling distinctly annoyed. Not that he showed it, however, for his niece was sitting opposite to him, and there were particular reasons why she should not know he was disturbed. The morning's letters had just arrived, and there were two for him. The first was from his solicitors announcing that, in the interests of Miss Maud McIver, they had just negotiated for the sale of a portion of the late Mr. Andrew McIver's landed interests for the sum of £118,000. The second was from Mark ROMILLY, and he wrote that he was shortly leaving South Australia for good and would like to come and see them to bid goodbye. He wondered if they were now at home at Glenelg. He had resigned from the police force, he said, and was joining a relative upon a sheep station in New South Wales. He asked to be very kindly remembered to Miss McIver. Thomas McIver frowned angrily. Of course, he could see through it, he told himself. The man only wanted to come down and see Maud. Thomas McIver was no fool, and ever since that evening when Inspector ROMILLY had dined with them along with Sir Charles Andover and Hiram Pellew, he had been anxious as to what his niece might do. He had had a great shock that evening, and a greater one, too, upon one of the days immediately following. Before he left, his friend Pellew had been what he called frank with him, and quite outspoken as to what was passing in his mind. Indeed, much too outspoken, McIver had thought at the time. The morning the American had been going away, he had taken McIver on to one side and had confided to him drily and with an amused twinkle in his eye that not only was Inspector ROMILLY undoubtedly in love with his niece, but also, and McIver here had nearly had a fit, he was quite sure that in return she was in love with the inspector too. McIver then, against his own instinct, for he had not been unmindful of several little changes in his niece lately, had at first been contemptuously incredulous, but his friend had snapped his teeth together viciously and told him bluntly not to be an old fool, but to just use his own eyes for himself. Also, he had added with a grin that if he, Hiram Pellew, were any judge of character, he was quite certain Maud would get her own way in the end, even if she had to propose to the inspector herself. In conclusion, he had given it as his deliberate opinion that it would be quite an excellent match, and he had warned McIver with some heat not to interfere and ruin his niece's whole life. Pelew's words had worried the old man a good deal, and for the first few days after his departure, every day he had been expecting ROMILLY to be making some excuse to come up to the house. But as the days and finally the weeks had passed and they had heard nothing more of him, his fears had gradually begun to die down. Finally, the danger was past, he told himself, and his niece was safe. The man had gone out of her life, and she might never perhaps see him again. Anytime, too, someone else might come along, and then once really in love, she would soon forget the foolish fancy that she might have had. He had breathed in great relief, for, of course, it was quite unthinkable that a girl with all the money Maud was going to have could marry a man with no money at all, however nice and desirable he might be in himself. And this £118,000 was only a part of what the estate would bring. The very idea was absurd. Now, however, had come this letter, and it at once brought everything back into the danger zone again. Of course, he would have to make some excuse and put him off, but then again, of course, he could not do so without mentioning it to his niece first. He must be very diplomatic and very tactful. He glanced across the table at her. She was looking out of the window, and her thoughts were evidently far away, for the movement he made in handing over one of the letters went unnoticed. Critically, he took in all the details of the beautiful face, and with something of a pang, he thought suddenly that she looked ill. She was certainly thinner than usual, and whiter, too, and there were darker lines than there should be under her eyes. Then the poise of her head was one of dejection, and there was sadness and melancholy even in the way she sat. In an instant, then everything struck at him like a blow, and the anger and annoyance that he had felt a moment before melted almost in the passing of a second to sympathy and regret. Damn it all, he said suddenly to himself in a complete revulsion of feeling. Why, after all, shouldn't she have the man she loves if he's her deliberate choice? What has money to do with it? She has money enough for all they both can ever want. What good are more thousands to her if her life isn't going to be a happy one? He thought of the little Californian girl and remembered he was growing old. Oh, how short life was and how soon the gray days came. Dear, gentle Maud, and she was pining now because she was without the lover that it was only natural she should want to have. Hers was the very age for love, not the wandering, curious love of just awakened girlhood, but the calm, reasoned love of a woman who would love with her head as well as her heart, and to whom passion was the expression of her love and not love itself. He was a fool to try and thwart her. Instead, he would help her to her choice. He would have the man here, and in closer intimacy, she would be able to see it she were disappointed or strengthened in her love. Why hadn't he thought so about that before? It was really the sensible thing to do. Maud was so refined and sensitive herself that very little would put her off the man if there were anything rough or coarse about him. That was why, he was sure, she had never taken him in before. He coughed loudly and rustled the papers. Maud, dear, he said, without looking up, I have 2 letters here, and both will interest you. She turned languidly, with an almost audible sigh. What is it, uncle? Lawyer's letters, I suppose? One's from Brown and Riley. They've sold the Kingston estate for £118,000. What a lot of money! Again with a sigh. What on earth shall I do with it all? Money's always useful, Maud, he replied. You'll find some use for it right enough. Then there's this other letter, and he began very busily to stir his coffee. It's from Mr. ROMILLY, from Broken Hill. He wants to come down and see us to say goodbye. He says he has left the police and is going on a station in New South Wales. There was a deadly silence for a moment, and Maud got up to attend to the urn. Oh, Mr. ROMILLY, she said quite steadily. Yes, I heard he had resigned from his position. He's coming to Adelaide in any case, went on her uncle, but here's his letter, read it. He asks to be kindly remembered to you. The girl took the letter, and there was a long silence in the room. Mr. McIver pretended to be busy with his newspaper, but all the time he kept a covert eye upon his niece. In appearance, she was quite cool and undisturbed. She put down the letter presently and started interestedly upon her breakfast. Well, dear, what shall we say? asked the old man at length. The girl looked up quickly. Why? Ask him to come, of course, she replied with a bright smile. He was always very nice to us. And her uncle noticed with a glow of satisfaction that her sad and dejected mien had all gone. For the remainder of the meal she laughed and chatted in a manner very different from that of the usual Maud of late. He was convinced he was doing the right thing. After breakfast, they went out onto the veranda and stood looking at the sea. A breeze was blowing down the gulf, but the air was soft and balmy, and something of the sweetness of life came up to them both. I think, said old McIver meditatively at length, we had better ask that young man for a weekend, if he can come, say from next Friday to the Monday. It will be interesting to hear all his adventures with the great Gilbert LaRose. Don't you think so, dear? The girl looked straight out to sea where the rippling waters were. Just as you like, uncle, she replied very quietly, if you think it best. Was there a tremor in her voice, he thought, or was it just the hesitation natural to her considering? Affectionately, she took her uncle's arm, and some impulse made him bend down and kiss her on the forehead. She smiled uprightly at him, and then suddenly, without a word, she threw both arms round his neck and buried her face in his shoulder. Dear little woman, he said fondly, pretending not to notice anything. I often think your nerves are all unstrung. I must take you for a long sea voyage some day. But just you go and write that invitation to Mr. ROMILLY now, and I'll post it straight away when I am up in the city. Mrs. Carter was very angry when she heard the invitation had been sent. Really, Thomas, she said sourly to her brother when they were alone, sometimes I think you're almost a fool. Fancy asking that man down here to stay. Can't you see what's in his mind? He's in love with Maud. I saw it the instant he came here to dinner that night. All his clothes were new. He'd bought them purposely for the occasion. Fancy a policeman with a dress suit. I don't care whether he was a major in the army or not. He was a policeman when he came here, and that's enough. I shall snub him unmercifully when he comes, and put him in his proper place at once, and I'm sure, if I know anything of Maud, she will do so too. Thomas McIver said nothing, but he smiled a slow, inscrutable smile. He wondered what exactly was going to be Mark ROMILLY's proper place. A feeling of amazing happiness thrilled through Mark ROMILLY when he received the letter from Clyde House. He had certainly hoped they would ask him to call at the house, but he had never for one moment dreamed that he would be invited to stay there, and the significance of the invitation made him almost giddy in surprise. What did it mean? He asked himself. The McIvers, as far as their home life was concerned, were most particular people. Why were they asking him now to stay with them in this easy way, just as if he were a friend of the house? Really, he was only an acquaintance at best. True, he had been to dinner with them once, but that had been more of an invitation of duty, he felt sure. He had been simply asked up then as a small return for the part he had played in the Andy McIver case, and just to be quietly given the check. But this visit would be quite different, and there was no question at all of duty or obligation about it. There was intimacy about it, as if they were willing to regard him as a friend. What could have happened since he last saw them? Could it be? And his heart beat furiously, and he crimsoned hotly at the thought. Was it miraculously possible that some part of the feeling he himself had for Maud McIver, she on her side also had for him? Could it be she who had suggested that he should be asked to stay for the weekend? Surely it was hardly possible. The circumstances of her riches placed her so much above him. It was not that he had no opinion of himself, and had had no success in his life with the other sex. He had had several love affairs, and the other sex generally had not been particularly averse when he had imagined, for the time, he was in love with them. But with Maud McIver it was quite different. She was wholly in his sight, and more an angel than a woman to be loved. It was worship almost that he felt for her. Still, and he was thoughtful for a long while, still, Maud was a woman after all, and pure and heaven-faced though she was. One day, she would close those beautiful eyes of hers, tilt up that proud, reliant chin, and give to the tingling fire of passion the purity and sweetness of those lovely lips. Yes, she was only a woman after all. But old Thomas McIver, why had Thomas McIver asked him? The old man, least of anything, was not a fool. He was a shrewd and level-headed level-headed man of the world. There could be no sentiment about him. He would understand the danger of any single man being thrown much in contact with his niece. She was beautiful undeniably, and rich, and anyone at any time might fall in love with her and try to engage her love in return. Certainly then it would be his aim to keep all undesirables away, and if he admitted anyone into the charmed circle of their home, then, again, he would do so clearly with the idea that the intruder was not one of the black sheep to be purposely kept out. For a long, long while before replying to the invitation, the late inspector of the Adelaide police pondered and pondered again. Then the solution flashed on him suddenly. Something had happened, he told himself, to bring him forward into Mr. McIver's mind, and the old man had invited him to stay at the house to make sure what sort of man he was like. In other words, he was going to be put on his trial. Mark ROMILLY whistled to himself, and the next moment was very angry that he could really be so vain as to imagine that Mr. McIver could be particularly interested in him in any way at all. The following Friday afternoon, Mark ROMILLY arrived at the McIvers just in time for the afternoon cup of tea. There were several callers in the drawing room, and Maud McIver was presiding daintily over the tea. She gave him a friendly little greeting, with perhaps just a trace of heightened color, and then waved him to a vacant chair that happened to be next to Mrs. Carter. He smiled grimly to himself when the latter lady gave him a short and curt good day, but at the same time he was certainly not displeased at the early and opportune encounter. Indeed, it was exactly what he wished. He was still convinced that in some subtle sort of way he had been invited up to Clyde House on trial, and if that were so, he argued there were going to be three people who would be his judges and whom he would have to win over: Maud, Mr. McIver, and Mrs. Carter. Maud. Well, he hoped and prayed Maud was favorably disposed to him already. Mr. McIver he put down as neutral and prepared justly to judge him on his own merits. But Mrs. Carter was hostile, decidedly hostile, and so she must be won over without delay. She was nursing a little party-colored Pomeranian, and he was able to tell her at once with strict truth that the animal was a beautiful little creature. He leant over and stroked the dog, asked about his breeding, and pointed out the good points that he had inherited from his aristocratic ancestors. He knew something about Poms, fortunately, and Mrs. Carter was soon convinced that he was worth listening to. In spite of herself, she was attracted to him, and long before the callers had taken themselves away, her voice had lost some of its acerbity. "But how do you come to know anything about Poms, Mr. ROMILLY?" she asked curiously. "I thought you men were never interested in these little dogs." "Oh, really, that's quite a mistake. But I happen to be particularly interested in Poms because the man who lived next door to me at Prospect was the chief breeder in South Australia. He had Poms all over the place, and I was always returning stray ones to him over the garden fence. I got to know the good points of them that way." Mr. McIver came into the room at that moment and raised his eyebrows just a little when he saw the two heads close together. "Great Jupiter!" he ejaculated whimsically to himself. "What if the aunt should cut the niece out? I never thought of that." It was a cozy little dinner that night with only the four of them, and ROMILLY made further advance into the good graces of the elder lady. She was an inveterate gambler of the half-crown type at the racecourse tote, and if she was not going to the races herself, always, nevertheless, managed to get someone to put the money on for her instead. For the past few Saturdays, it appeared she had been heavily supporting. Her brother smiled and looked highly delighted here, a beast called Ragtime, and each time the wretched animal had let her down badly. They would only have just got about 4-1, even if it had come in first, but not only had it not come in first, but it had run so extremely badly that at last in despair they, and everyone else interested, had left off backing it. Then, of course, the inevitable thing had happened. It had simply romped in first, and paid over 20-1 in dividend. ROMILLY agreed with her that it was a scandal and a shame. "But what are the stipendiary stewards doing?" asked Mr. McIver with a twinkle in his eye. "When my sister has heavily supported any animal, they ought, of course, to be specially vigilant to make sure it is run fairly." "Oh, you needn't laugh, Thomas," replied Mrs. Carter tartly. "Everybody knows we can't get the class of men we ought to for stipendiary stewards. They're a mistake altogether. All this while Maud was serene and happy. Every time Mark Romilly was speaking to the others, it gave her the opportunity to watch his face. What a fine, strong face it was, she thought. He looked so handsome and such a gentleman, too. She preferred not to join in any of the conversation, but was quite content to listen and enjoy her own thoughts. Oh, how dreadful if anyone should guess what those thoughts were. She pondered, however, if someone in the room would one day know them. Somehow she thought he would. She could feel he was interested in her, although he did not glance much at her. But she saw him several times looking down at her hands out of the corner of his eye, and once for quite a long time his glance rested on her arm and shoulder. Mr. McIver, too, was quietly analyzing his guest. He had drawn him out on several subjects, and found him interesting and well-informed. Pressed for some details of his life on active service, the one-time major had given them a thrilling picture of some happenings in the war. Without in any way boasting or making a lot of things, he had brought home to them the dreadful times they had been through. He made little of what he had done himself, but to all of them he gave the impression of the quiet, fine courage of the soldier. They went into the garden for a few minutes after dinner, and quite naturally the two younger people wandered on alone. They were silent for a minute, but of the two the girl was by far the more self-possessed. It was she who first broke the silence. "I had no idea, Mr. Romilly," she said archly, "that you were really such an authority on dogs. I'm sure you've quite won over my aunt's heart by your admiration of Coco this evening." Mark Romilly coughed moderately. "Knowledge is always useful," he replied guardedly, "and the young lady you now refer to as Coco certainly has some very good points about her." The girl opened her eyes very wide. "But I thought you said," she went on laughing, "she would deserve a prize anywhere." "Certainly, undoubtedly she would, but whether the hard-hearted judges would give her one is quite a different matter. You see, I was only putting everything in the best light possible." "Oh, Mr. Romilly, I believe you're a fraud. I shall really begin to be half afraid of you." "Heaven forbid!" he exclaimed fervently. "The fear is on my side. Your sex always frighten me. Witness my desire to stand well with Mrs. Carter tonight." They came to the end of the garden, and instinctively both halted by the trellis where the rose trees were. Tacitly no reference had been made to the former tenant of the White House, but a chord of memory was now stirred in them both. "I won't suggest a rose for you," she said demurely. "It's never well to pick them at night." "I don't want one yet," he replied pointedly. "I'm not going until Monday." She resumed her steps at once with this, and they returned slowly to the house. The next day was one that would be always remembered by Mark Romilly as a red-letter day in his life, for it was then that he first realized decisively that Maud McIver might not after all be beyond his reach. She was almost constantly near him the whole day long. In the morning they went for a long walk upon the sands. Mr. McIver brought Vulcan out with them for exercise, and as he was apparently far more interested in the big boar hound than in his two companions, they were consequently left very much to themselves. They talked confidingly together as if they were old friends, and he told her a great deal of the happenings of his life. He glanced at her a lot when he was talking, and very often their eyes met in a deliciously sympathetic sort of way. 100 times he thought to himself how beautiful her eyes were, but in her face, with all its sweetness, there was such a wealth of pride that she almost overawed him, and once or twice he was quite frightened to remember that he had dared to fall in love. Maiden in every dainty way she was so obviously, and it would be almost wicked, he told himself, to quicken answering love in her. It would be like robbing the unpicked flower of its fragrance, or the untouched peach of its bloom. In the afternoon Mr. McIver took them for a drive among the hills in the car. "You will sit at the back with my aunt, Mr. Romilly," said the girl with a sly smile. "She is bringing Coco with her, and so both of you will be quite happy. You can be instructing Aunt how to prepare Coco for the next show. She is most keen now on entering her." Romilly made a little grimace of disappointment, but Mrs. Carter at that moment coming out, he gallantly escorted her to the car, and for the first part of the drive was intensely bored by having again and again to enumerate the outstanding good points of of the wretched Pomeranian Coco. Maud McIver, however, apparently enjoyed it all. Sitting just in front, she could, of course, hear most of what was being said, and from time to time, her slim and elegant shoulders quivered in real appreciation of the fun. Presently, Mrs. Carter began to complain that she was getting too much wind at the back, and with just a little hesitation, her niece very obligingly offered to change places with her. Henceforward, the drive then was all a paradise to ROMILLY. The girl was close by him, and sometimes when the car swayed among the narrow turnings in the hills, for the fleeting seconds, he could feel the touch of her lithe body next to his. Once under the outspread rug their hands met accidentally, but she moved hers away casually as if quite unaware of the fact. They touched again in a minute or two, however, and this time at once. For a moment, he imprisoned the soft, warm fingers in his own. Only for a moment, however, and she had quickly drawn her hand away. For a little while, then he was afraid to look at her, but feeling her eyes upon him, he glanced up suddenly and saw that she was smiling and frowning at the same time, but with no appearance of annoyance on her face. She only shook her head reprovingly at him, and made a little meaning nod in the direction of the unsuspicious aunt sitting just in front. He smiled back in understanding, and for the rest of the drive had to content himself with furtively regarding her out of the corner of his eye. For her part, she had folded her arms and lay back looking straight in front of her. No doubt she was thinking of what had just happened, but from the expression of her face, her thoughts were not unhappy ones. It was the Sunday evening, and they were walking slowly round the garden the last thing before going to bed. ROMILLY had been telling her his plans for the future, and she had been listening happily with her face upturned to his. Suddenly a silence fell upon them, as if they had nothing more to say. Reaching the drawing-room windows, she stopped before them in the light. "Well, good night," she said with a sudden shyness. "I'll leave you to your cigarette. I must be going in now." "Oh, just once more round," he pleaded. She hesitated for a moment, and then, without replying, resumed her walk. They were still silent, but it was the silence of tender and caressing thoughts. There was only the starlight above them, but in their hearts were lights that shine surely from another world. So they walked round the garden, and, reaching the house again, she stopped as she had done once before. But this time she stopped in the shadows. "Good night," she said very quietly, holding out her hand. "Good night," he replied softly, taking it in his own. So for a moment they stood, each looking down, he with his eyes upon her face, she with her eyes upon the ground. Suddenly she looked up, and in an instant she was in his arms. He had seen something in her face that had told him surely what he might do. Tenderly, very tenderly, he tilted up her chin, just as he had told himself in his dreaming that one day he would do. She closed her eyes, and gently, very gently, he put his lips on hers. She shivered violently, and almost a cry escaped her. He pressed her tightly to him, and then suddenly, with a great sigh, released her from his arms. She ran quickly into the house. It was fully a quarter of an hour or more before ROMILLY went into the house. Mr. McIver was standing by the dining-room door. "Come in and have a drink," said the old man, looking hard at him over his glasses. They sat down, and for a little while there was silence between them. "I hope you've enjoyed your visit," said Mr. McIver at length. "I'm sure we've been very pleased to have you." ROMILLY replied how he had enjoyed himself, and expressed his appreciation of their kindness. Then again the silence fell. "Well, my boy," said Mr. McIver in a moment, "you seem to have got on very well with my niece." He went on grimly. "She is a very rich woman, Miss McIver. I expect you understand that." "Oh, yes," assented ROMILLY very quietly. "I quite expected so. But then, of course," said the old man drily, "money doesn't count with you. A man who refuses £2,000 for nothing must be pretty contemptuous of the advantages of hard cash." "Oh, please don't rub that in," laughed ROMILLY. "It was hard enough to refuse without the soreness of being reminded of it. Well, I told you at the time you were a fool, but come now, why didn't you take it? Be honest with me now. Was it because of Maud? Was it a matter of sentiment with you?" ROMILLY took a long, thoughtful puff at his cigarette. "It might have been partly that," he said slowly. Then he went on warmly. "At any rate, it gave me more pleasure to to refuse than to accept, and honestly I should do so again. That's truth. The old man eyed him narrowly. Then I suppose you've fallen in love with Miss McIver, haven't you? He said brusquely. ROMILLY was very calm and deliberate. Your niece is a lovely woman, sir, he replied, and I should be no man if I had not. Mr. McIver was thoughtful again. I like you, ROMILLY, he said quite kindly at length, or I shouldn't have asked you up here, but it's a great matter to protect my niece. No, no, man, he went on quickly. I'm not your enemy, and I'm not against you. Beyond certain limits, it's not for me to interfere. I know it's the girl's own affair, but I'm only anxious she should get happiness in her life. But come, let us leave it for the present. Help yourself to some whiskey and tell me about your future plans. Chapter 16. Mark Jervis ROMILLY. Breakfast time at Clyde House the next morning was not without its embarrassments for 3 of the 4 people seated at the table, and it was only Maud McIver herself who seemed entirely at her ease. Mr. McIver was thoughtful and curious as to how far his niece and ROMILLY had committed themselves together the previous day. Mrs. Carter was in a bad humor because of an attack of rheumatism that she was sure was coming on, and ROMILLY himself was nervous that perhaps he had been too forward the previous evening and had lost ground with the woman that he loved, for with the morning light, the presumption of his intending to ask her to be his wife seemed, to say the least of it, to be a staggering one. But Maud herself was radiant, and the 3 others at the table there wondered each in their own several ways if anywhere there could be a brighter or a happier looking girl than the one now sitting before them. ROMILLY regarded her in the way a lover always does before his happiness is assured, admiring, almost reverential, and with eyes of hungry longing. Mr. McIver smiled grimly to himself with just a touch of sadness in his heart that the sweet white rose was now so openly unfolding her petals, and Mrs. Carter wondered rather sourly what on earth the girl had done to make herself so pretty. The meal over, they went into the garden, and Mrs. Carter, whose animosity against ROMILLY had seemingly all returned, did her utmost to make herself as disagreeable as possible. She asked interestedly as to what time his train was going, and she supposed, pointedly, that he would not be down in the city again for some years. She gave it as her opinion, too, with a significant glance at her niece, that probably some very great changes would have eventuated before they would all be meeting again, and, finally, she advised him strongly to marry, for he would find it hard, she said, to cook and manage on his own. A deep flush of annoyance came into Maud McIver's face, but ROMILLY himself took it all in good part and smiled as if in amusement, when once he happened to catch the girl's eye. Presently, to the great relief of the others, Mrs. Carter took herself back into the house, and then, as ROMILLY had not to leave for some hours, Maud suggested a short walk along the sands. Mr. McIver at once sportingly made an excuse for not coming, and so, in a few minutes, it was Maud and ROMILLY alone, who were pacing slowly by the weaves. In after days, ROMILLY always said that that walk was a very miserable one for him, for he had been no longer in a mood to appreciate that he was alone with Maud. Notwithstanding his own self-reliant nature, his assurance had been chilled violently by the remarks of the girl's aunt. It was quite obvious what she meant to imply, and although he had no opinion at all of her ideas, still she had undoubtedly revived to great strength in him the recognition of the inequality between his own position and that of Maud. Was it colossal impudence, he now asked himself, that he should be daring to ask her to be his wife? She, a well-endowed heiress, and he, quite a poor man. There would be some people who would always say he had come after her money, and if fortune so greatly favored him that Maud returned his affection, there would still be always those who would sneer at her that she had not been married for love. Could he, too, make up to her for the other sneer that she had married a man who had once been in the police? His mind was in uncertainty, and he wanted time to think. His meditations were interrupted. "You're very quiet, Mr. ROMILLY," said Maud with a smile. "I hope your thoughts are pleasant ones." ROMILLY sighed, and then he smiled too. "I've known better and worse," he replied enigmatically, and then he at once rallied himself, and went on to talk interestedly clearly about the beautiful view before them and the sea. Apparently, his previous meditations had been quite trivial and casual ones, but the girl was not deceived. She had guessed something of what was passing in his mind, and she wanted to make up for her aunt's coldness and clear away the impression that her relative's remarks might have made. Hiram Pellew had not been a bad judge of character when he had surmised that with all her gentleness and pride, love would give Maud McIver courage and make her bold. Notwithstanding her bright appearance at the breakfast table that morning, she had slept little the previous night, and, being under no misapprehension as to ROMILLY's feelings towards her, it was in her mind to make it easy for him to ask her to be his wife. She knew that she herself was willing, and she was determined that no consideration of money or the want of it should debar them from the happiness that she was sure might now be theirs. So she laid herself out to be encouraging to him, and during the next half hour ROMILLY realized to the full then, if indeed he had never done so before, how gracious and tender she could be. She asked him interestedly about the possibilities of his new life, and she looked him frankly in the eye as she spoke. She thanked him prettily for his kindness to them in the great trouble they had been in, and she told him frankly that both she and her uncle would be very sorry now if he went out of their lives. For herself, she said, she was quite disappointed he was going away, but it was all to no purpose. She had reckoned without the chivalry of ROMILLY and the newborn determination on his part that she must not be precipitated suddenly into any position she might afterwards live to regret. He must have time to think. He kept on telling himself he must have time to think. So he fenced lightly with her and persistently relegated the personal equation into the background. He did not dare to look much at her, however, and many times he groaned inwardly and wondered if he were both a coward and a fool. The girl was very puzzled at his attitude and could not understand. The walk ended at last, and they returned to the garden of Clyde House. Just inside the gate they met Mrs. Carter and Major Poole. The Major was gallantly escorting that lady to a sheltered spot on the sandhills where she would be out of the wind. The two men stopped to speak for a moment, and Mrs. Carter seized the opportunity to sidle up to her niece. "Keep him at his distance, Maud," she whispered. "He never takes his eyes off you when you are not looking, and if you're not careful, he'll propose." She nodded her head viciously. "I believe the only thing that's kept him back so far is that he knows he's got no money." The girl looked at her coldly, but made no remark, and Major Poole having now finished his goodbyes, the two couples again went on. ROMILLY and Maud passed down to the end of the garden, along by where the rose trees were, and suddenly the girl made up her mind. They were quite by themselves now and out of view of all the windows of the house. She stopped and faced her companion. Her heart was beating furiously, but she smiled easily with a happy smile. She had plucked a little gloire de Dijon, and she held it out now to him in a beautiful white hand. "Isn't it lovely?" she asked innocently. "Yes, lovely," replied ROMILLY gravely, and for the moment taken off his guard. "I've always thought it was." Maud colored up. She smelt the rose and brushed it lightly over with her lips, then she held it out towards him once more. "Well, you can take it," she said ever so softly. "That is, of course, if you want to." ROMILLY got as white as a ghost, but he reached out quickly and took both the hand and the rose. "Which may I have?" he asked hoarsely in a low whisper, and looking her straight in the eyes. There was a long silence, and then ROMILLY suddenly straightened himself up and let her hand go. "You're a rich woman, Maud," he said gently, "and I am a poor man," and with a grave bow he made as if to turn away. But Maud laid her hand upon his arm. "Riches don't count always, Mark," she whispered, "and the richest woman may be the poorest if she's not brave enough to take love when it comes her way," and her voice choked as if she were going to cry. For perhaps 1 second ROMILLY hesitated, but it was impossible now for him not to understand. With a great beating at his heart, he slipped his arm around her and pulled her to his side. Her head came to his shoulder unresistingly, and for a long, deep moment he looked passionately into her eyes. Her lips parted to a long-drawn sigh, and then closed shiveringly as he bent to meet them with his own. It was the moment to them of both their lives, and love in all its glory overflowed to them in that kiss. It was a kiss of ecstasy. purity, a kiss of rapture, and yet a kiss so reverent and so gentle that, but for its length, it might have been no kiss at all. Oh, love of man for maid. Oh, love of maid for man. Lodestar of life and mystery of all years. Was ever heaven nearer to us, and was ever earth more lovely than when the swoon of passion held us and we wandered in the garden of desire? About an hour later, coming in from the garden, Mrs. Carter saw ROMILLY opening the door of the garage. So, she remarked gleefully to her brother, whom she encountered the next minute in the hall. Mr. ROMILLY's going off before lunch, is he? I see they're getting out the car. She laughed knowingly. I thought he looked very dejected when we met them a little while ago, but I knew, and the laugh became almost spiteful here, I knew that Maud would soon put him in his proper place. Thomas McIver looked thoughtfully at his sister, and for just a moment, perhaps the very faintest flicker of a smile crossed into his face. Then he sighed gently. Well, they'll be married in less than 2 months, Elizabeth, he said quietly. They've gone off now to the city to buy the engagement ring, but they'll be back in time for lunch. Mrs. Carter, mute in the stalemate of her own emotions, sank into a nearby chair. A few weeks later, one evening towards dusk, a big gray car was speeding along the coast road under the cliffs towards Cape Jervis. It is a lonely, desolate road at all times, and for many, many miles the seagulls are the only signs of life. There were a man and woman in the car, and from the amount of luggage piled up at the back it might quite reasonably have been assumed that they were out on tour. A close observer, however, would have noticed at once that there was something quite unusual both about the car and its occupants. Everything about them was apparently quite new. The car particularly would have arrested the eye. The enamel on it was quite unscratched and without a blemish anywhere. The upholstery was quite beautiful in its freshness. The bonnet mirrored back exactly all the subtle shades of land and sky, and the very tires themselves seemed new and quite unworn. One might have almost thought that the car had just been bought or given as a present. A wedding present, perhaps. Then, too, the leather trunks looked new, and one could have sworn that the very straps were stiff and hard and would be difficult both to fasten and undo. Altogether, it was a car that, quite apart from its occupants, would have arrested attention anywhere. But the man and woman were interesting too. They looked so happy together, and all the time they seemed to be smiling and looking at each other. Notwithstanding the care needed to negotiate successfully the narrow, winding road, the man's eyes never for long left the woman's face, and when he turned, her eyes were always waiting to meet his. The woman was certainly very pretty, and something had given to her face quite a lovely flush. Her eyes were sparkling brightly, and she looked as sweet and happy as if there were no pain nor sorrow in all the world. Altogether, the car was in every way a car of joy and happiness, and no one would ever have dreamed that misfortune was hovering so near. Yet so it was. Suddenly, there was a loud, crashing sound. The car bumped roughly, and tilting all on to one side, swerved violently across the road. With a great effort, the driver turned it straight again, and then, with a jar that shook both occupants unpleasantly, brought it ingloriously to a standstill. "Not hurt, darling!" exclaimed ROMILLY anxiously, for it was he who was driving the car. "Not hurt?" "No, dear," replied his wife brightly. "Not a bit. But what's happened now?" "Nothing much. Only the axle broken, I expect. But I don't mind that so long as you're not hurt." And, helping her out of the car, he kissed her tenderly as she stepped down. "Oh, damn," he said a moment later. "Beg pardon, dear. Yes, we're snookered right enough. Axle gone to the pack. Now, Mrs. ROMILLY, what are we going to do?" The girl laughed a bright silvery laugh. "What an adventure for our first day of married life. It's quite thrilling, isn't it?" "Too thrilling for me," he replied grimly, taking out his watch. "Here we are, 4:45, miles from anywhere, absolutely helpless, and it'll be dark in half an hour. Looks like rain, too." But the girl was still smiling. "Never mind, dear. Nothing matters on a day like this. But, oh look, there's smoke over there among the trees." He turned quickly to the direction in which she was pointing. "By Jove, what a bit of luck, and I'd have sworn we were 10 miles at least from a house anywhere. We'll go at once and see what's doing. We may be able to send for help, although I'm afraid there's not much chance. If not, perhaps they may be able to put us up. Less Less than 100 yards from where they were standing, the cliffs fell away for a short distance, and about a quarter of a mile inland they came upon a small farmhouse. A dog ran out to meet them, barking vociferously. He was followed immediately by two women and what seemed to ROMILLY a whole pack of dirty and untidy children. "Good Lord," he ejaculated feebly to himself. "What a place to commence one's honeymoon in, even if they can put us up." He explained quickly what had happened and inquired anxiously if there were any possible means of getting a conveyance to take them to an hotel that night. "No, sir," at once replied the elder woman, shaking her head. "It's 17 miles to Yankalilla, the nearest place, and there's no way of getting there tonight. My husband's away now, and there's no horse or trap till he comes back tomorrow." ROMILLY almost groaned in anguish. "Can you put us up?" he asked hesitatingly. "Can you give us a bed tonight?" The woman looked doubtful. "We can give the lady a bed in the room with us," she replied at length. "And there's a little tent you can have to put up outside. That's the best we can do. You see, we've only 3 rooms here, and there are 7 of us already to sleep." There was no help for it, and a few minutes later the newly married couple were getting what necessities they needed urgently for the night from the car. It was almost dark as they were retracing their steps to the little house, and ROMILLY was glum and disappointed to a degree, but his wife squeezed his arm affectionately. "You dear old thing," she laughed shyly. "I'm so sorry for you, but it's only a few hours longer away, and I shall be all yours tomorrow. I shall be dreaming of you tonight, dear, at any rate, so think of me as you go to sleep." "Go to sleep," growled her husband, and then he, too, broke into a laugh. He kissed her fondly. "It would be quite funny if it weren't so tragic," he said. "Just fancy anyone's honeymoon commencing like this." They had their meal with the rest of the family, and the bride and bridegroom, much to their astonishment, soon found themselves laughing and talking almost as if they were in their own home. Maud had brought some biscuits with her from the car, and it was a real delight to share them with the children there. The little ones had soon forgotten their shyness, and with their hands and faces well scrubbed for the occasion, they were not half so formidable to sit near to as ROMILLY had first thought. He joked with them, chucked them under the chin, and tossed them for sixpences until, when bedtime came, so fascinating had he made himself to them, their mother had great difficulty in getting them away. Everyone went to bed early. Maud said she was not sorry, for she was tired and wanted a good sleep. She bade her husband a passionate good night at the house door, and with a whistle of philosophical resignation, the latter marched off to his lonely couch in the little tent. An old campaigner, he had made himself as cozy a shelter as possible among the bracken on the hillside, about 100 yards from the house. The small tent they had provided for him was a patchy, dilapidated sort of affair at best, but he had fixed it up in a workmanlike manner, and at least, he thought, it would afford him cover should any rain fall. He had made himself a comfortable bed of hay, spreading one motor rug on top, and with another and a couple of blankets for cover, he looked forward to being as comfortable as possible under the circumstances. He undressed, and with a wistful glance at the little house below, tucked himself in and tried to forget his disappointment in sleep. But sleep was decidedly shy of coming. Firstly, his thoughts kept him awake, and then the lighthouse on Cape Jervis troubled him. He had left his tent flap open, so that as he lay he could watch the window of the room where he knew his bride was sleeping. He could be thinking of her all the time, he told himself, and would then gradually drop off to sleep. But he had not taken into account the disturbing factor of the great light on the Cape Head. It was directly opposite to him, about 3 miles away, and there was an annoying fascination in watching it in the dim blackness of the night. For quite an hour, but it seemed much longer to him, in spite of his wish to ignore it and go to sleep, he lay watching it, and in desperation he was just going to get up and pull the tent flap down when suddenly a slight sound from the direction of the house arrested his attention and kept him perfectly still. He heard the gentle click of a door, and then saw a faint shadow detach itself from the darkness of the house. To his amazement, it picked its way quickly in his direction. He leant up upon his elbow, and then he held his breath. The figure was all muffled up, but there was no mistaking that walk. It was his wife's. He was on his feet in an instant, and, holding open the tent door, waited for her to approach. approach. She saw him watching her and put her finger to her lips. In a moment, he had folded her passionately in his arms. "I simply had to come, dear," she whispered between his kisses. "I couldn't bear to think of you here by yourself tonight." "You are an angel, darling," he whispered back, "but you really ought not to have come. You said, and he looked straight into her eyes, you wanted to go to sleep." The months had rolled on, and it was nearly spring again. Two men were talking on the steps of the General Post Office in Adelaide when a big gray motor car flashed by. "There goes the luckiest man in all Australia," remarked one of them enviously. "In the police only about 18 months ago, and now one of the wealthiest men in city, and with a fine, good-looking wife too. My word, but she is a lovely woman, Mrs. Romilly. Do you know her?" "Yes, my boy," returned the other, "and she's as charming as she's lovely. They've got a kid now too." "Oh, I didn't know that, but I've been away from Adelaide lately." "What is it, a boy or a girl?" "A boy. My wife went to the christening last week." "A son, eh? Well, what have they called it?" "One name is rather peculiar. It was christened Mark Jervis Romilly." "Oh, that sounds all right, but I quite thought for the moment that you were going to tell me they had called it Joseph Cloud." The end.